how does a tiny, completely isolated dot deep in impoverished Africa become this massive miracle that just, shatters every pessimistic prophecy ever made?
It is the ultimate puzzle. I mean,
Right.
when you look at the raw data and the history here, none of it should logically make sense.
Right.
It basically defies all the accepted laws of economic gravity.
Welcome to the deep dive.
Hmm.
You are about to hear a story that defies absolutely everything you think you know about geography, economics, and human destiny.
It really does. We are looking at a fascinating piece of research today.
Yeah, a working paper by Harvard professor and National Bureau of Economic Research scholar Jeffrey Frankel. It's titled Mauritius, African Success Story.
And our mission today is to completely deconstruct the underlying logic here.
Right.
How did Mauritius succeed where almost everyone else failed?
Exactly. We are going to look past those surface level statistics. We're exposing the shocking historical compromises they made, and, well, we'll uncover the ultimate counterintuitive secret of this island's survival.
We are stripping away all the myths today. We are looking at the actual mechanics. How do you build a stable, prosperous nation entirely from scratch, using literally the worst possible starting materials?
So let's just jump right into the deepest stereotype people hold. When most people think of mainland Africa, especially in the mid to late 20th century, the dominant narrative is a total lack of the rule of law.
Right. It's a narrative of instability. Corruption, fragile states, military coups.
But if you look closely, the undisputed world champion of African governance is just sitting quietly out in the Indian Ocean.
Yeah, when you measure this objectively, using the World Bank's World Governance Indicators or the Index of African Governance, Mauritius isn't just doing well.
Right.
It ranks dead first. Number one.
Wait, hold on.
Yeah.
When people think of top-tier #1 governance, their brains immediately go to, like, Switzerland or Scandinavia, places with centuries of institutional buildup.
Sure.
You're telling me this tiny island with a heavy history of colonialism and slavery is operating on that exact same level?
Objectively, yes. I mean, in the context of the continent, it beats out heavyweights that are often praised. It beats Botswana. It beats Cape Verde. It completely outpaces South Africa. Now, is it a flawless, magical utopia? Of course not.
Right, nowhere is.
Exactly. If you talk to locals, you will definitely hear complaints about nepotism or local corruption, just like you would in Chicago or London.
Sure.
But from a macro perspective, compared to its regional peers and other developing nations, its institutional stability is an absolute fortress.
The rule of law holds. Contracts are actually enforced. Power changes hands peacefully.
Yes. Good governance isn't just a nice phrase there.
Yeah.
It is the bedrock of everything they built.
But good governance on paper is one thing. You get a gold star from the World Bank, you get to speak at fancy conferences. But what does it actually buy you? What does it buy the person walking down the street?
It buys you life, wealth, and an actual future.
Which brings us to the economic reality. What I like to call the 5X growth myth. Here is the setup for you, listening right now. Imagine an isolated island.
Very isolated.
There's zero oil beneath the ground. There is no gold, no diamonds, no valuable minerals whatsoever.
None. Just dirt and sugarcane.
So how does that specific formula equal a rich population living to be almost 73 years old?
The statistics from Frankel's paper are genuinely staggering. I mean, look at the period between 1970 and 2010.
Okay.
The per capita gross domestic product of Mauritius, essentially the average economic output per person, grew by 5.4% annually.
Every single year.
Every single year for 40 straight years.
I want to pause and really put that in perspective for you. If you contrast this with the rest of Africa during that exact same 40-year period, the rest of the continent averaged just about 1% growth.
Right. And 5.4% versus 1% might not sound like a massive galaxy-level difference in a single random year.
But over time.
Exactly. When you compound that over 40 years, the outcomes are completely divergent. It is the literal difference between total stagnation and a complete societal transformation.
By 2010, Mauritius reached an average income of roughly $11,000 in purchasing power parity, meaning, adjusted for the cost of living there, they had serious, real-world spending power.
And their life expectancy hit 72.8 years. They secured a high human development ranking, placing 81st globally.
It's like watching a runner with heavy lead weights chained to their ankles just blowing past the rest of the sprinters on the track.
It really is.
It shouldn't happen.
Not.
By all traditional economic logic, they should have face-planted at the starting line.
And look, you aren't the only one who thinks that. That is exactly what the absolute smartest minds of the 20th century thought when they looked at this island.
They didn't see a miracle brewing, did they?
Not at all. They looked at Mauritius and confidently predicted an absolute catastrophic apocalypse.
Two separate Nobel Prize winners looked at this country right around the time of its birth, and they essentially signed its death certificate.
Yes. And we really need to be clear here. These were not internet trolls. These were not random political pundits. These were globally respected intellectuals. In 1961, James Mead, who would go on to win the Nobel Prize in economics, traveled there to analyze the island's prospects.
And what was his final verdict?
He stated that heavy population pressure and intense political conflict made the outlook for peaceful development completely, and I quote, poor.
He thought they were doomed to a Malthusian trap, right?
Exactly. Too many people, not enough resources, leading to inevitable starvation and war.
And he wasn't alone in that doom-mongering. V.S. Naipaul, the Nobel Literature Laureate, visited in 1972.
Oh, his quote is brutal.
It really is.
Wow.
He famously called Mauritius an abandoned imperial barracoon.
A barracoon.
Yeah, for those who don't know, a barracoon is literally a temporary enclosure used to hold slaves before they were sold. It's a horrific image.
He looked at the place and said the nation was completely incapable of economic or cultural autonomy. He thought it was just a tragic mistake of history that was left to rot.
So we have to be fair to Mead and Naipaul here. They weren't just being mean-spirited for the sake of it.
No, based on the hard empirical data available to them at the time, their predictions were completely rational. The mathematical and social variables they were looking at spelled total disaster.
So what exactly were they looking at? Let's break down what I would call the 3 geographic death sentences.
Right.
If you are building a country from scratch, Mauritius has the absolute worst possible starting stats. Small, extremely remote, tropical.
Yes.
In traditional economic modeling, that specific combination is basically a death sentence.
Let's unpack the physical reality they were facing. First, size. Mauritius is only 1,865 square kilometers.
To visualize that, it's microscopic on a global scale.
In economics, size really matters because of internal economies of scale. If you want to build a massive, highly efficient car factory, you need a large domestic market to sell to just to get the business off the ground.
Right, you need local buyers first.
Exactly. A tiny island cannot support heavy, modern industrialization on its own. Plus, you lack a diverse array of natural endowments.
Second, remoteness.
It is one of the most remote places on planet Earth.
When researchers measure this, what they call the weighted average of log distance from other countries, which is basically how far you are from major global markets, Mauritius ranks alongside the most isolated South Pacific islands.
It is deep in the Indian Ocean. It's further out than Madagascar. Moving physical goods to and from the island is just incredibly expensive.
And third, it is tropical. Now, people hear tropical and they think of a nice beach vacation with a cocktail. But in terms of national development, the tropics are historically brutal.
Being tropical usually means being plagued by devastating diseases like malaria, which just destroys your workforce. It means poor soil quality for many high-value temperate crops.
And crucially for Mauritius, it means extreme weather.
Yes, the cyclones.
The island is routinely battered by violent cyclones that can flatten an entire year's agricultural harvest in a single afternoon.
So if you put these variables, small size, extreme isolation, tropical climate, and natural disasters, into a standard economic equation, the math just guarantees you will be poor.
Like I said, if you're rolling a character in a video game, you just drew the worst possible starting stats.
You really did.
But bad geography was just the physical problem. The human problem was much, much more explosive.
Oh, absolutely. Social scientists generally consider a low degree of ethnic fragmentation to be the best environment for early economic growth.
Think of highly homogeneous places. When everyone speaks the exact same language, shares the same religion, has the same cultural background, it is just much easier to build initial social trust.
Exactly. Highly fragmented societies usually struggle, especially in newly independent nations. They fight over scarce resources, they split into factions, and unfortunately, they often fall into civil war.
And Mauritius in the 1960s was a ticking ethnic time bomb. The demographics were incredibly fractured.
You had roughly 68% of the population being of Indian descent. But even that supermajority was deeply and sometimes violently split between Hindus and Muslims.
Right.
Then you had the Creoles, who were the descendants of enslaved Africans. You had the Franco-Mauritians, the wealthy white descendants of the original French colonizers who still owned almost everything. And you have the Sino-Mauritians, a smaller but highly significant immigrant population from China.
This wasn't just some academic theory about ethnic tension. Right before they achieved independence in 1968, brutal ethnic riots broke out in the street.
People were dying.
The local authorities completely lost control. They literally had to call in British troops to fly in and restore order before the country even officially existed.
When you have ethnic fragmentation at that specific level, it is usually a massive red flag for economists studying national development. It almost always leads to paralyzed governments, extreme nepotism, and endless cycles of retributive violence.
And those deep ethnic divisions, they didn't just organically appear out of nowhere, they were engineered.
Yes.
Because Mauritius was built for one thing and one thing only: sugar.
Right.
Relying entirely on a single plantation crop is the ultimate historical recipe for tyranny and slavery.
This brings us to a really fascinating historical and economic concept called the Engerman-Sokolov theory. It's a specific, highly destructive version of what we call the natural resource curse.
Let's break that theory down for the listener because it perfectly explains the trap Mauritius was caught in. How does the Engerman-Sokolov theory actually work?
So, Stanley Engerman and Kenneth Sokolov were economic historians. They looked at the colonization of the Americas, and they asked a really fundamental question.
Okay.
Why did places like the United States and Canada get incredibly rich and develop strong democracies, while much of South America and the Caribbean struggled with deep poverty and dictatorship, even though they started with abundant resources?
And the answer was literally in the dirt.
Precisely. They found that lands perfectly suited for lucrative plantation crops like sugar, cotton, or tobacco almost always developed toxic extractive institutions.
Why is that?
Because sugar requires massive, incredibly expensive mills to process. You need enormous scale. So only the ultra-wealthy can afford to set up the plantations in the first place.
And to make those massive plantations profitable, you need an army of cheap labor.
Yes. The elite capture all the wealth and all the land. They build legal and political systems based on extreme inequality, dictatorship, and state control just to protect their massive estates.
They rely on slavery. Or, later on, forced indentured labor.
Exactly. They deliberately do not invest in public education or voting rights because an educated voting workforce would demand higher wages and ultimately dismantle the plantations.
And Mauritius was the absolute poster child for this nightmare scenario. It was a 150-year-old monocrop sugar economy. Sugar wasn't just part of the economy, it literally was the economy.
The French colonizers first used slaves brought over from Madagascar and mainland Africa to work the brutal cane fields. When the British took over and eventually abolished slavery in 1835, the wealthy white Franco-Mauritian elite suddenly faced a massive labor shortage.
Their entire sugar empire was suddenly threatened.
Right, so they executed what was called a great experiment. They imported roughly 500,000 indentured laborers from India.
They funneled these workers through a dock called a Pravasi Ghat. It was essentially the Ellis Island of Mauritius, but instead of welcoming immigrants to the American dream, it was processing desperate workers into grueling, multi-year plantation contracts.
So fast forward to the 1960s, and the stage was perfectly set for deep, explosive class resentment.
You had a tiny, ultra-wealthy white elite owning the massive sugar estates, and you had a massive, poor, disenfranchised population of rural Indian workers and urban Creole workers.
In almost every other post-colonial story, this is the exact moment the newly independent nation tears itself to pieces.
Right, you have the oppressed majority finally getting political power, and their immediate instinct is to take back the land.
Exactly.
On the eve of independence, the left-wing political party in Mauritius faced this exact choice. And they did something completely shocking. They made an unthinkable class compromise that went against all their ideological instincts.
To really understand this, we need to look at the Labour Party in 1960. They were the dominant political force, heavily backed by the rural Indian workers. They naturally leaned socialist.
Sure.
Their core platform, which is totally understandable, was to nationalize the sugar plantations. They wanted to seize the massive estates owned by the wealthy white oligarchs and redistribute the wealth to the people who actually bled in the fields.
Just to provide some historical context here for you, in a post-colonial environment in the 1960s, seizing the assets of the former colonizers is incredibly common. It's practically expected.
Oh, absolutely.
You saw it in Cuba, you saw it in parts of Africa, you saw it across the developing world. It's the standard revolutionary playbook.
But they didn't do it.
No.
The Labour Party, under the leadership of a man named Siwusugu Ramgoolam, dropped the demand for nationalization entirely. They completely reversed course.
Sure.
Instead of seizing the land, They established an ironclad rule to protect private property.
Why does this matter so much? I mean, on paper, it looks like they totally sold out their own voters. Why is this specific decision the turning point for the entire nation?
Because it changed the entire economic and psychological trajectory of the country. By vehemently protecting private property, they erased the elite's fear of independence.
The Franco-Mauritians, who held almost all the domestic capital and the vital technical knowledge of how to actually run the global sugar industry, they kept their wealth.
Yes, and this prevented massive capital flight.
So the rich people didn't pack up their money and flee to London or Paris.
Exactly. If the elite had fled, the economy would have collapsed overnight. But beyond just keeping the money on the island, it established a sacred precedent for the rule of law.
It showed international observers and local citizens alike that the new government would not govern by theft, whim, or historical retribution. They were going to play by the rules.
It was a massive, incredibly mature compromise.
But it wasn't enough to unite the country instantly. I mean, only 55% of the population actually voted for independence. So you have a brand new country where almost half the people didn't even want the country to exist in the first place. How do you stop a deeply divided, heavily armed population from tearing itself apart on day one?
You have to understand how fractured and terrifying that 1967 election was. The Creoles and the Franco-Mauritians voted largely against independence.
Because they were terrified of what they called Hindu hegemony.
Yes. The idea that the Indian majority would simply use the new democratic system to permanently oppress everyone else once the British left. The Labour Party won the election, but just barely.
So Siwa Segura Ramgoolam becomes the first prime minister of this deeply fractured rock. What does he actually do?
What he did next was politically masterful. Instead of ruling with an iron fist, instead of punishing the opposition factions who aggressively campaigned against him, he voluntarily invited them into his government.
He formed a broad coalition.
Yes.
It's like a CEO winning a vicious year-long boardroom battle, finally getting total control of the company, and their very first executive act is to put their biggest rivals on the board of directors.
It requires a massive suspension of ego.
It really does.
And this wasn't just a one-time feel-good gesture. This became the fundamental norm of Mauritian politics. Ever since independence, Mauritius has been ruled by coalition governments.
Cabinet power is carefully and deliberately shared among the different ethnic groups. No single group, not even the Hindu majority, is ever allowed to entirely dominate the executive branch. They force themselves to govern by consensus.
But, they actually took it a step further than just informally handing out cabinet appointments. They hard-coded this compromise right into the law.
They explicitly rejected the Western democratic ideal of a perfectly colorblind one-man, one-vote system.
Right.
They looked at their ethnic differences, acknowledged them openly, and wrote them directly into the Constitution.
During the preparations for independence, there was this massive, intense debate about how to structure the voting system. The British authorities wanted pure proportional representation. The Labour Party wanted single-member districts because they knew their demographic advantage would allow them to dominate entirely. They eventually compromised in 1967 with what was called the Banwell Commission.
And what came out of that commission is one of the most brilliant and, frankly, bizarre electoral designs in the world. Walk us through how this best loser mechanism actually works.
Okay, so they divided the country into 20 voting districts. Each district elects 3 members to parliament. So that gives you 60 elected members.
Simple enough.
But here's the twist. The Electoral Commission is given 8 extra, totally unassigned seats.
The best loser seats.
Exactly. After all the votes are tallied, the Electoral Commission looks at the overall results and the demographic makeup of the new parliament.
Okay.
If a minority group, say the Sino-Mauritians or the Muslims, is mathematically underrepresented in parliament compared to their actual population size, the commission steps in. They give those 8 extra seats to the highest performing runner-up candidates from those specific underrepresented minority groups.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, what's so fascinating here is that they threw ideological purity out the window. In a Western democracy today, telling someone they get a seat just because of their ethnic background, even if they explicitly lost the vote, would cause an absolute constitutional crisis.
Oh, massive lawsuits immediately. But Mauritius realized that Western democratic idealism wouldn't keep the peace. They prioritized stability and inclusion over ideological purity.
By guaranteeing those seats, they ensure that no minority group ever feels entirely locked out of the halls of power.
Right. It creates a permanent institutional safety valve. You cannot easily convince a minority group to start a violent revolution if you literally guarantee them a seat at the table to air their grievances.
So they've established property rights, they've shared power, they've guaranteed minority representation, and then they made perhaps the most rational yet totally radical decision of all.
The military decision.
Yes, they declared independence and immediately refused to build an army. Not only were they not conquered, but this decision made them incredibly wealthy.
They looked at their neighbors. They looked at the endless cycle of violence on the African continent in the 1960s and 70s. And they essentially said, no, thank you.
In 1992, the military spending in Mauritius was an absurdly low 0.45% of their gross domestic product. That equated to just $6 per capita.
Compare that to the rest of the neighborhood. The Cold War was happening. Everyone was buying tanks and fighter jets.
The average military spending in sub-Saharan Africa at that exact time was 2.8% of GDP, $20 per capita. Many nations were spending far, far more than that, completely bankrupting their treasuries just to build up standing armies.
So what did Mauritius do with all that saved money? They didn't just hoard it, they dumped it straight into human capital.
Sir Ramgoolam granted free education to all citizens. Literacy skyrocketed to 87%. They heavily funded public health initiatives.
But the fiscal savings, as massive as they were, are really only half the story. The true genius of not having an army is political.
Because by not building a military, they completely removed the tool most commonly used for military coups in developing nations.
Exactly. You cannot have a rogue general launch a military dictatorship if you do not give the general an army in the first place. They literally disarmed the greatest threat to their own democracy.
So we have all this incredible historical context. Now let's look at how this physically altered their economic destiny. When you run the massive mathematical models on global island nations, the traditional laws of geography just seem to vanish for Mauritius.
Frankel's paper does a really deep dive into the econometrics here. Economists use regression models to try to isolate what actually causes a country to be rich or poor. They look at 33 different island countries globally to see patterns.
I want to make sure we don't get lost in the academic jargon here. Let's translate these data tables into plain English for the listener. The paper mentions a tropic penalty that is massive. What does that actually mean for the human beings living there?
So when economists look at the data for these 33 different island nations, they use a mathematical formula to isolate the weather and location factors. They found that just being located in the tropics basically puts a massive anchor on your economy. The paper notes a specific statistical penalty, a negative coefficient of 1.11, or even 1.8 in some models.
To put it simply, non-tropical countries have roughly a 6-fold economic advantage over tropical countries, assuming all other things are equal.
The tropics mean disease, relentless heat that lowers worker productivity, and poor agricultural yields for most high-value crops. It's a massive, crushing disadvantage.
But Mauritius overcame that 6-fold disadvantage. They are a tropical island, but they aren't core. So how did they break the mathematical rule?
Because of another variable in that exact same formula, the rule of law.
Right.
When the researchers factored in the strength of an island's institutions, Mauritius's score was massively positive and highly significant. It had a plus 0.731 coefficient.
The data proves mathematically what we've been discussing historically. Strong institutions can literally outmuscle bad geography.
The structural compromises they made, the coalition government, the absolute protection of property, the independent courts were so incredibly powerful that they essentially canceled out the economic damage of being a remote tropical island.
Good laws beat bad weather.
Every time.
Which leads perfectly into a broader question about the whole continent. Why do remoteness and hot weather fail to explain the massive wealth gap across African nations?
That's a great question.
Because according to Frankel's data, the real geographical killer in Africa isn't the heat. It's being locked in dirt.
If you look at the Africa-specific regressions in the paper, straight-line remoteness from global markets doesn't actually matter as much as you'd think.
Why not?
Because in Africa, physical distance is largely irrelevant if you can't move goods at all. What really matters is getting your goods to a deep-water port. Being a landlocked country in Africa is a devastating penalty.
The data shows it is over a 50% disadvantage compared to having a coastline.
Exactly. If you can't put your goods on a ship, you basically can't participate in global trade.
But wait, let me push back on that. If simply having a coastline is the secret weapon, then a country with a massive, sprawling coastline like Somalia should be an absolute economic powerhouse. Obviously, that isn't the case. So what's the missing variable?
Because once again, the rule of law is the ultimate trump card. In the Africa-specific data, the rule of law has a highly significant positive effect on wealth.
Think about it practically. Access to the sea only works if you have the laws to protect the ships, the cargo, and the ports.
You need enforceable contracts so global buyers actually trust you. You need functioning courts to settle inevitable disputes. You need a stable state that can literally pave the road from the factory to the port.
A coastline without the rule of law just gets you piracy and smuggling, not prosperity. Mauritius had the ports, and they built the ironclad laws to protect them.
So they have the rule of law, they have the sea access, they have the free education.
Now they actually need to build an economy that isn't just cutting sugarcane. This brings us to a strategy I call the dual-track hypocrisy.
Oh, this is fascinating.
Mauritius didn't become a tiger economy by blindly following the dogmatic rules of total free trade. They played both sides of the fence brilliantly.
This is a crucial point, especially because mainstream economists usually love preaching the gospel of pure free trade. Open your borders, drop your tariffs.
Right, the Washington Consensus.
But in the 1970s and 1980s, Mauritius was highly protectionist. They heavily restricted what could be brought into the country. Import licensing covered nearly 60% of all goods.
Their domestic import protection rates, the taxes and tariffs on foreign goods, exceeded 100% in many cases.
So they were essentially building a massive wall to block foreign goods, artificially keeping prices high to protect their own fragile, highly uncompetitive domestic businesses.
But they knew that a tiny island couldn't survive just selling things to itself. They needed foreign cash. They desperately needed to export.
So in 1970, they came up with a brilliant workaround. They created an export processing zone, or an EPZ.
No, an EPZ isn't necessarily one giant walled-off city with barbed wire. It's a legal status.
Yes. Inside this designated zone, or for companies granted this special status, the rules of the country completely changed.
If you were manufacturing goods strictly for export, you got massive tax advantages. You were allowed to pay lower minimum wages. And crucially, any raw materials or heavy machinery you imported to build your products had zero tariffs.
That's a perfect way to look at it.
I always think of it exactly like a high-end nightclub. At the front door, the bouncers are turning everyone away. It's totally restricted.
The bouncers in this scenario being the aggressive import quotas protecting the fragile local businesses from foreign competition.
Exactly. But out back, there's a VIP entrance where the velvet ropes are parted and the champagne is flowing freely, but it's entirely reserved for export businesses bringing in foreign capital.
It was a highly heterodox strategy, meaning it completely defied orthodox economic theory. They fiercely protected the domestic market while simultaneously hyper-stimulating the export market.
But setting up an export processing zone is just passing a piece of paper. A lot of countries pass laws to set up these zones. Most of them fail miserably.
Zimbabwe, Senegal, Madagascar, they all tried it, and they didn't become manufacturing powerhouses.
So why did Mauritius succeed where so many others failed? Because they didn't just beg for foreign direct investment and let foreigners run everything. The locals actively siphoned the technology.
Paul Romer, a prominent growth theorist, argues that the real value of foreign direct investment isn't the actual money. It's importing ideas.
It's importing the technical know-how, the management strategies, and the vital global connections.
And for Mauritius, those transformative ideas came directly from China.
Yes, specifically from Hong Kong. At the time, Hong Kong textile manufacturers had completely maxed out their export quotas to Europe and the U.S. under an international treaty called the Multi-Fiber Agreement.
They physically weren't allowed to export any more shirts or pants from Hong Kong. So these Chinese businessmen were desperately looking for a new location to build factories that had unfilled quotas.
And Mauritius had those open quotas.
They brought the initial idea, the startup capital, and the technical know-how for large-scale textile manufacturing straight to the Mauritian EPZ.
But the Mauritians didn't just stand on the assembly line, watch the machines run, and collect a tiny minimum wage paycheck while the massive profits went back to Hong Kong.
That is the secret engine of their industrialization right there.
Wow.
The locals rapidly siphoned the knowledge, they paid very close attention, and they had the capital to buy in.
Remember the Franco-Mauritians? The wealthy sugar oligarchs who kept their money because their land wasn't nationalized.
They took their massive sugar profits and partnered up with the foreign textile firms. By 1984, Fully foreign-owned operations accounted for only 12% of employment in the EPZ.
That is an incredible statistic. The foreigners started it, but within a little over a decade, local Mauritians controlled 50% of the equity in these massive export factories.
They didn't just rent out their cheap labor to global corporations. Local capital partnered up, learned the complex logistics of global supply chains, copied the manufacturing methods, and literally took ownership of the industrialization process.
It is the ultimate example of economic self-discovery. They leveraged the ethnic links of the Sino-Mauritian population to build initial trust with the Hong Kong investors, brought the factories in, and the whole island learned how to run a modern industrial economy.
But to buy into those massive factories, they needed massive amounts of cash.
And they got that cash through what I like to call the golden sugar squeeze. In 1974, global sugar prices absolutely exploded, and Mauritius made a diplomatic choice that looked completely stupid to short-term thinkers, but made them filthy rich for 30 years.
This is a masterclass in global diplomacy and long-term economic restraint. In the early 1970s, Britain joined the European Common Market, which was the precursor to the EU.
This meant that all the old trade deals Britain had with its former colonies in the Commonwealth had to be completely renegotiated from scratch.
Now, it just so happened that in 1974, right as these tense negotiations were happening, the world spot market price for sugar hit an absolute record high.
Everyone else producing sugar was chasing that quick cash.
Oh.
They wanted to sell their crops on the open market and make a massive immediate killing that year.
But Mauritius looked at the global chessboard differently. They knew commodities always crash, boom, and bust.
So during the negotiations for what became the 1975 Sugar Protocol of the Lomé Convention, instead of chasing the temporarily high spot market, Mauritius locked in a massive, guaranteed quantity quota with Europe at domestic European prices.
And domestic European prices are heavily, heavily manipulated. European governments heavily subsidize their own farmers, so they artificially keep agricultural prices very high.
Precisely. Mauritius negotiated a deal that essentially said, we will sell you a massive fixed amount of sugar every single year, but you have to pay us the exact same artificially high price you pay a French or German farmer.
And Europe agreed. When global sugar prices inevitably crashed back to earth a few years later, Mauritius was safely insulated inside Europe's protectionist bubble.
They were getting paid vastly more than the world price. This generated what economists call massive economic rents, essentially capturing a guaranteed, artificially high profit margin thanks to a heavily protected market.
How much money are we talking about here? It was staggering.
These sugar rents averaged 5.4% of their entire GDP annually for decades.
It's the ultimate marshmallow test. They skipped the quick cash grab, locked in a stable, decades-long contract, and essentially let European taxpayers fund their national development.
They captured those massive profits and pumped them straight into infrastructure, education, and buying into those new textile factories.
It was brilliant economic opportunism. They played the geopolitical game perfectly, but, no artificial advantage lasts forever.
Which brings us to the moment of truth. Steering through the storms. When globalization abruptly turns against you, how does a tiny, vulnerable boat avoid being shredded by the macroeconomic winds?
By ruthless, proactive adjustment.
The golden era had to end eventually. In 2004, the perfect storm hit Mauritius. First, the European Union finally reformed its agricultural policies, and those massive guaranteed sugar preferences effectively died.
Second, the global multi-fiber agreement officially expired. The global textile market became totally open and quota-free.
And who dominates a totally open, quota-free global textile market?
Massive, low-wage manufacturers in mainland China and Southeast Asia. They flooded the global market. Mauritius simply couldn't compete on cheap labor anymore.
Almost overnight, Mauritian manufacturing output plummeted by 30%. Employment in this sector dropped 25%. The national balance of payments and the budget deficit deteriorated rapidly.
To outside observers, it really looked like the Mauritian miracle was finally over. The luck had run out.
But what was their response? Did they panic? Did they default on their debts? Did they launch a populist uprising blaming foreigners?
No. Their response was pure, ruthless pragmatism. The government enacted a multifaceted, highly aggressive reform program.
In 2006, they implemented a simplified, flat 15% tax rate for individuals and companies to instantly attract businesses back to the island.
They passed a Business Facilitation Act to deeply deregulate hiring and firing, making the labor market highly flexible. They openly welcomed foreign talent and immigrants to fill critical skill gaps.
They didn't cling to dead industries. They adjusted. And historically, they have always been masters of counter-cyclical survival.
Even back in 1979 and 1981, when global oil prices spiked and threatened to bankrupt them, they didn't just borrow endlessly.
They actively intentionally devalued their own currency by up to 30% to make sure their exports stayed cheap and competitive on the global market. They take the painful medicine early. They do whatever it takes to stay afloat.
And even within the sectors that were dying, the companies that survived didn't just give up, they innovated. A prominent company like Company Mauritius Textiles saw the Chinese threat coming.
They didn't try to compete on cheap basic t-shirts.
They brought in new, highly skilled management. They massively automated their textile spinning with cutting-edge robotics.
Yeah.
And they fully integrated their supply chain so they could respond to rapid high-end fashion trends in Europe in a matter of weeks.
Something massive, sluggish Chinese factories couldn't pivot fast enough to do.
But you can't automate everything, and you can't rely on textiles forever. When your sunset industries finally die, how do you escape what economists call the middle income trap?
Where you are too rich to compete on cheap labor, but too poor to compete with Silicon Valley on pure innovation.
You pivot to high-value services. With sugar and textiles permanently shrinking, Mauritius looked for a totally new model. They looked at Singapore as a template, a small island, highly educated, acting as a global hub.
They pivoted hard into the third sector of the economy. What does a third sector pivot actually entail for an isolated island in the Indian Ocean?
They moved into high-end luxury tourism. They heavily developed information and communication technology, or ICT, becoming a hub for data centers and business outsourcing.
But most importantly, they developed highly sophisticated financial services.
And this is where they leveraged their unique demographics as a superpower once again.
Exactly. They utilized a brilliant double taxation treaty they had signed with India years earlier.
By combining that highly favorable tax treaty with the deep cultural and ethnic links their population shared with India, this isolated island quietly transformed itself into an offshore financial center.
They became the largest single source of foreign direct investment flowing into the massive, booming Indian economy.
They positioned themselves as the safe, legally secure, culturally fluent gateway for global capital looking to enter South Asia.
So to recap this incredible journey, they went from a barren rock with extinct birds to a brutal sugar plantation to a bustling textile hub to a high-tech financial center funneling billions into India. It is a stunning evolution.
It really is.
But we still haven't answered the most profound question. Why? Why them and not anyone else? This brings us to the deepest secret of all. An island of strangers.
This is where we answer the ultimate question. Because everything we've talked about, the policies, the compromises, other countries have tried them, but they didn't work.
Let's do a direct comparison to really hammer this home. Fiji and Mauritius. On paper, they are nearly identical twins.
They are both remote tropical islands. Both were colonized by the British. Both were built entirely on monocrop sugar economies.
And crucially, both imported massive populations of Indian indentured laborers to work the fields, fundamentally altering their demographics forever.
But Fiji is plagued by regular military coups, deep ethnic violence, and economic stagnation. Mauritius is stable, peaceful, and rich.
Why did the exact same recipe produce two entirely different cakes?
It is the absolute biggest aha moment of this entire deep dive.
Yeah.
It comes down to one single fundamental demographic difference, a difference of deep history.
Fiji has an indigenous population, native Fijians who have lived there for thousands of years.
And when the British brought the Indian immigrants over to work the sugar fields,
the native Fijians naturally and deeply resented them.
As the Indian population grew and gained economic power, it led to a toxic, violent sons of the soil nativism. The native Fijians felt their ancestral homeland was being literally stolen.
When an ethnic Indian was finally elected Prime Minister of Fiji in 1999, he was quickly overthrown in a military coup driven by sheer native resentment. That nativist backlash fractured the country, drove out Indian capital, and repeatedly destroyed the Fijian economy.
But Mauritius was a completely barren rock. The famous dodo birds were the only natives, and the Dutch wiped them out in the 1600s. There were absolutely no indigenous human beings on Mauritius.
Think about the massive psychological implications of that. What happens to a society when literally no one is from there?
It changes the entire paradigm of belonging. Every single person in Mauritius, the French colonizers, the African and Malagasy slaves, the Indian indentured servants, the Chinese merchants, every single one of them arrived on a boat from somewhere else.
Nobody could claim special ancestral privileges to the land. Nobody could stand up in parliament and say, my ancestors were here 1,000 years before yours, so my people deserve more power.
That is staggering. Because there was no original claim to the land, it forced a radical, unavoidable mutual tolerance.
They had to figure out how to live together because none of them had a superior moral claim to the dirt under their feet. They were all just strangers trying to survive on a rock together.
It is what some sociologists call the immigrant isle theory. When everyone is an immigrant, you either compromise or you all drown together. You can't expel the others because you are all others.
So they chose to build institutions that carefully balanced everyone's interests. The ethnic fragmentation that Meade thought would destroy them was actually the very thing that saved them, because it was a fragmentation of absolute equals.
Which brings us to our final thought, the echo of the island.
As the modern world retreats into populism, as nations build border walls and tear themselves apart over questions of who belongs and who doesn't, a tiny rock in the Indian Ocean proves that our deepest fears about diversity might be entirely wrong.
Let's summarize the ultimate lesson of Professor Frankel's paper. Mauritius didn't succeed despite its intense divisions, its miserable geography, and its ethnic fragmentation.
Right. It succeeded because those intense vulnerabilities forced it to build ironclad institutions of compromise. They knew they had zero margin for error.
Let's review the checklist of how you build a miracle. They rigorously protected private property rights to prevent capital flight and build trust. They voluntarily shared executive power in the cabinet to prevent any one group from feeling oppressed.
They built the incredibly unique best loser electoral system to mathematically guarantee that minority voices were always heard. They actively welcomed immigrants and foreign ideas.
They completely abolished their military to fund public education and structurally prevent military coups. And they practiced brilliant, ruthless economic opportunism, from sugar quotas to flat taxes to constantly reinvent themselves.
They took every single geographic and historical disadvantage, the extreme isolation, the cyclones, the ethnic tension, the complete lack of resources, and forged them into a weapon for relentless economic growth.
It is an incredible blueprint.
Here is something for you to chew on after this deep dive is over. In a world where massive mainland superpowers, countries with infinite natural resources and sprawling land masses are currently tearing themselves apart over cultural differences and historical grievances. What does it say about human nature that the most stable, prosperous society in Africa only worked because literally everyone was a stranger in a strange land?
Is our fierce, instinctual obsession with who got here first the exact thing holding our global economies back?
Think about whether the very things we fight over are the anchors dragging us down. Keep questioning the obvious, and we'll see you next time.